Chaos erupted on the streets of Harare yesterday as preliminary election results filtered through. We saw army tanks and police vehicles. The situation certainly getting very tense at times. Let's get the latest now from my colleague Thulas Simelane, who was there in the thick of it all yesterday. Thulas, good morning. It looks like, just looking behind you, the visuals there with a lady sweeping the floor. It's like back to business as usual this morning in Harare.
Well, it's sort of back to business as usual, Dan, but the country is still reeling from the shock of the death of those 3 people yesterday in that confrontation and the violence that took place on the streets of Harare during that protest by members, or shall we say people who were protesting about the results, and some of whom was seen to be supporting Nelson Chamisa and the MDC. It ended up with those confrontations, of course, between police initially, and there were some shots that were fired, and then later on there was the intervention of the military. What you're seeing behind me, what we are showing you, is the cleanup campaign that is taking place this morning, particularly in the area where the violence and the battles were fought between the protesters and the police, and then later on the army. The area in front of Rainbow Towers Hotel precinct, which also houses the Harare International Convention Center, which is, of course, at the moment the National Results Center for the ZEC. It was the center, that precinct behind us was the center of focus for the anger of the protesters, because that's where the counting and tallying of votes is taking place, and that's where really the verification is taking place ahead of the release of the results of the presidential election. So late last night, yesterday, the police minister, the Home Affairs minister, working with the police commissioner, invoking Section 37 of the Public Order and Security Act, that controversial act that has over the years been blamed for a clampdown on opposition activity, on public gatherings, and really the freedoms and civil liberties of Zimbabweans. That section was invoked, allowing for the army to take part in assisting police to bring law and order in Zimbabwe.
Does this act mean, the invoking of this act mean that public gatherings have now been banned in Zimbabwe?
Well, at this point, then, it seems what the police are encouraging people to do is to, if they don't need to be out and about, they should remain at home, and also saying that those who are going to work should go to work and go straight home. I did hear the police commissioner, I think it was, saying exactly that. So, I mean, you can only imagine if basically the people are being urged to restrain, sort of restrict their movements to only necessary movements. It does suggest to me that any other activity is not being contemplated. I will have to check and come back to you on whether, in fact, this is indeed a complete ban on public, gatherings and protests. But you will understand then that this comes just after the voting day, which was on Monday. But even before then, there was already tension that had been growing. The opposition had been marching to the offices of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which is just across the road from where we are standing. That particular building had been the focus of opposition protests for quite some time, even before the election day itself. And at one point, there had been warnings by the government, by various people in government, who had been saying that the opposition should not take the tolerance of the Zimbabwe police and the state machinery as being weakness. In fact, it's a line I heard from Obed Mpofu, the Home Affairs Minister, again last night, saying that the tolerance and understanding should not be mistaken for weakness. As we saw, of course, yesterday, that clampdown from the military coming in. In fact, late last night, the police spokesperson, Charity Charamba, saying and using a language that is familiar to me, that I've heard in the past, being used against opposition activists, saying that they are keen, they are inviting, quote unquote, Tendai Biti and another MDC alliance official, Hepison Chidziva, to come to police CID law and order section they are keen to have a conversation with them. In the past, that only meant that they basically wanted to arrest people. We don't know if that means that is the case this time around, but the police are inviting BT and Chidziva, according to Charity Charamba, to help them understand what transpired in the protests that took place yesterday. Of course, the police are holding BT and Nelson Chamisa, the MDC leader, responsible for the violence that took place, as we heard from the police minister. Of course, the opposition itself saying that, I mean, how do you hold us responsible? You are the ones who pulled the trigger. It's the people who pulled the trigger, who fired live rounds, automatic weapons in the city center at protesters. The opposition insisting that their protests were peaceful, and saying that the spokesperson, the Nkululeko Sibanda of the MDC, saying that they know that this happens in dictatorships, that they will plant, the dictatorship will plant people to be at the forefront of protests and trigger violence and then react after that. And he says he has no doubt that is what happened here yesterday.
And very briefly, Thulas, is the counting the results. At what stage are we now? We know that officially the ZEC says Saturday was the final day, and we know that the National Assembly ones have been coming in, ZANU seemingly leading that, taking a resounding victory there. Presidential race, we're still waiting.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. We're just waiting for the presidential results at this point, because really the National Assembly counting and verification and announcement is pretty much done and dusted. There was one constituency, Harare Metropolitan, which was outstanding at the last media briefing, unless I missed another one by the ZEC. But that was the only one at the point at which, before, in fact, at the point at which the riots started, and we all, our attention was basically taken away from tracking the results.